So I want to welcome everybody tonight. We're so glad you can join us. We're still getting our sea legs with our multimedia presentation, but it seems to be doing pretty well. And it's very exciting tonight to welcome our speakers. But of course, I have to do a little housekeeping before. So I want to welcome everybody. We noticed everybody kind of dodged the raindrops and made it here in time, so hopefully it'll be a nice evening. Tonight's program is Nursing Clinical Decision Support, Governance, Lifecycle, and Implementation. The purpose of this program is to provide the participants with an overview of the implementation, basically to go over clinical decision-making in the electronic health record. I want to talk about Denise. Sorry about this. Bottom line is that we're here to talk about clinical decision-making and decision-making support. In order to obtain your CE, you need to sign in and register, you need to attend the program, and you need to do the evaluation. The evaluation will be sent to you via email. I'll send you a link. That's why we go over the attendance, and we'll mail that out probably in the next day or two. I also want to tell you that there's no conflict of interest, or any conflict of interest has been reconciled, and there's another bullet I forget right now. And the most important, I wanted to Denise Goldsmith is our speaker, and Sandy is going to do the introductions. But I also wanted to give a shout out to Denise because she was recently inducted into the American Academy of Nursing, which is really a great honor. So I'd like to do a couple of other things just in terms of housekeeping. I want to encourage everybody to go visit our webpage because we have a lot of good news. We do have our date for Trends, which we have already secured and reserved. So May 12th, out at Waltham Woods. And our keynote speaker is going to be Dr. Jane Engelbright, who's the CNO she's a senior vice president at HCA. So we're really excited to have her come and speak with us. For those of you, just FYI, I don't know if you noticed, but there is an NI certification review from the ANA. It started on the 1st, but it's remote. So it's probably not too late to jump in if you're kind of interested in that, and the details are on our website. I want to encourage you to go to the website and look over a lot of the video presentations from Trends, et cetera, are there. So any of you that are interested in those areas or are teaching and are looking for content, it's a great place to get really timely information. I do want to give a shout out to Tiffany Kelly, who's not here, but she has a book published, Electronic Records for Quality Nursing in Healthcare, and that we have information on that if you're interested on the website. And also, many of you are familiar with Virginia Saba and Kathleen McCormick's book, The Essentials of Nursing Informatics, and they were given something called a Duty Award, which I had never heard about, but it's basically awarded from a librarian society as being identified as an essential book to have in your library. So it was a big award, and it's really exciting. And in addition to that, there is the book, and they also have a teaching companion to the book, which is really exciting to hear about. And with that said, and also make sure you go to Computers, Informatics, and Nursing, because our member highlights from Trends, we have for the last couple of years been able to publish in Computers, Informatics, and Nursing, so it's kind of nice to know that. Isn't that exciting? So when you do a poster and you go through the work, I have to get a shout out to Regis Zilstorf and Karen Bavuso, who really helped put this all together, and Maureen too. Usually when we pick people for the panel for member highlights, we take those abstracts and we've been able to submit them to Computers, Informatics, and Nursing and get them published. Some people choose not to do it because they're publishing on their own, which is also very exciting. But it's a nice way to recognize our members and to get the word out about some of the exciting things we're doing. And it's kind of an easy way to kind of put your toe into the publishing arena, if you will. So I have talked already too much, and with that being said, I'll turn the introductions over to Sandy.
So I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers, but before I do, I want to make sure that folks know where to find the restrooms. They're down the hall, past the cafeteria. The first door is for males, the second door is for females. So please, down this hallway, don't go the other way, down the hallway where you came from towards the elevators. It'll be on your right-hand side. So Karen Bavuso, MSN RN. She is a clinical informatician in the Partners eCare Clinical Informatics Group at the Partners Healthcare Systems. She has been a registered nurse for over 30 years, working in a variety of healthcare settings. She has been working in the field of health informatics since 2006. Karen received a Master of Nursing Science degree with a specialty in informatics at Duke University. She received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from University of Massachusetts, Boston. Over the last several years, Karen has participated in a variety of electronic health record implementation and support activities. Her current focus is on knowledge management, clinical decision support, and structured clinical data elements. What a mouthful. And Denise Goldsmith, MS, MPH, RN, FAAN, is the Chief Nursing Informatician Officer at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She is responsible for providing leadership in creating a healthcare IT infrastructure that captures the Department of Nursing's unique contribution to patient and family care, providing direction for and management of advanced clinical system analysis and informatics throughout the department, and collaborating with others to identify opportunities for work process improvement of information management. Denise completed a 3-year fellowship in informatics at the Center for Clinical Computing at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Medical School. She was the recipient of the 2015 Rita D. Zielsdorf Nursing Informatics Leadership Award from the New England Nursing Informatics Consortium and the 2013 Alliance of Nursing Informatics Innovator Award. Denise was recently inducted as a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing, who recognized her contributions that arose from the innovative and evidence-based use of HIT to improve nursing practice and patient care in large healthcare systems. So welcome, Karen and Denise.
You're stuck up there, Denise. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone in the room and on the phone. Glad that everyone's interested in hearing about clinical decision support. I know I like talking about clinical decision support. So I guess first, as with anything, we do not have any relevant financial relationships with commercial interests. And so the agenda for today, we're going to first go through the governance structure at Partners Healthcare. We're going to do an overview of the Sidious Lifecycle. And then we're going to do an overview of the nursing Sidious implementation strategy and some Sidious interaction usage analysis that we had done on a subset of Sidious. And then what is the impact on nursing workflow, as well as lessons we learned along the way. So a little background about Partners and Sidious is Partners, as many of you know, has a very strong, robust history with Sidious. And they also, over the last few years, decided to move to an integrated EHR. We're still in that implementation phase of that, but multiple sites have rolled out. Now, prior to this, the majority of nursing documentation was done on paper, so really we didn't have that opportunity to have Sidious. However, nurses did have Sidious in the med administration, so they knew what Sidious was and they had interacted with it. So this really was a ripe opportunity to provide Sidious generated from nursing documentation. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How does it get from an idea, a ripe opportunity, to the end result, and even more so, the evaluation of the nursing Sidious that's out there now? And so I guess we'll start with, what is clinical decision support? Because people often ask, and it's really not an easy answer, even though it seems like it should be. It's from the healthit.gov gives a very, very broad definition of CDS, and their definition is really, it's a computer-based tool which provides clinicians, patients, or other people with knowledge, person-specific information intelligently filtered, so that's the criteria, and presented at the appropriate times. And it's to enhance healthcare. So that's a gigantically broad definition. And that definition includes alerts and reminders. It includes dosing guidance, order sets, patient reports, et cetera, et cetera. But we're going to have we're going to talk about alerts and reminders. So we're going to whittle down that scope to just alerts and reminders for tonight. And even specifically, nursing alerts and reminders. So we have a governance at Partners Healthcare for CDS, as with many other efforts we do. First, we have a CDS committee, and that committee is made up of approximately 50 voting members. That kind of, waxes and wanes over time. And these are enterprise-wide health professionals from all different specialties. There are approximately 30 non-voting members, and those are folks from clinical informatics, the application teams, clinical content, and the EHR vendor. And their role is to really approve and prioritize CDS that is going to be put in the system. Not every great idea gets to be put in the system. It has to go through the governance process. And we have in-person meetings as well as asynchronous discussions via collaboration tools. For those that have used collaboration tools, we'll see a screenshot of that. We also have the CDS Planning Committee, and this is a subgroup of the CDS Committee. It's representatives from clinical informatics, application teams, the vendor, and clinical content. And this group really reviews the options of how best to implement requests. It summarizes things. It prepares things to bring to the CDS committee. There are times where the CDS Planning Committee will make decisions on behalf of the CDS committee. And similarly, there are times when the CDS Planning Committee may need to look outwardly to get decisions or advice from other committees. So, there's a lot of committees that we speak to and we get information from, and an example is the Nursing Informatics Advisory Committee at Partners. So processes. The process for CDS is driven from the CDS Lifecycle, which we'll talk about each step of that. And this allows for a very consistent implementation across the enterprise, because now all of a sudden we have an enterprise system, right? We no longer have disparate systems. This is an enterprise system. Now, we do allow site-specific CDS. However, it's built on an exceptions basis. We say it's an enterprise unless otherwise said so, and there's a formal predefined guidelines we go through to determine whether it's not going to be enterprise. The process includes CDS inventory prior to go live. So prior to a site going live, we say, hey, what do you have in your system now? Is it in the system already? Do you need it? Okay, we'll move it through the CDS lifecycle. That's, the first phase. And then there's new and temporary CDS that we bring in and say, is it a good idea? Yes, no, and it moves to the life cycle. And then, of course, just because it's in doesn't mean it stays in forever. We have enhancements, silencing, or retiring of CDS. And it's just a continual process that you'll see when I show the diagram. So we have the governance, which is the rules and decisions. We have the life cycle, which is the overall process. And then we have these helper tools, which is the collaboration tools that allow for asynchronous discussions and documentation. We have our CDS tracking tool, and you'll see this throughout the presentation. It's really a database of all of our CDS, so that any given time we can go in and look to see where things are and, to make sure we're not duplicating CDS. And then we have testing tools. We track everything. We're from knowledge management, so we track everything and document everything for very good reasons. So we track our testing and bug reporting, and then we have a monitoring portal. And we'll see the results of some of that data that comes from this monitoring portal later in the slides. And there are really a robust set of tools now that we've developed over the last year and a half to look at what's happening in the production environment for these CDS. And of course, we're live, so we have a support and issue tracking for any CDS issues that are identified in the production environment. So here's the life cycle. Again, it drives everything. It starts with a request, and it moves straight through the approval, design, build, test, monitor, and evaluate. I will go through each one of these, but the majority of this talk is going to be focused on monitoring and even more so evaluation of some nursing CDS. The people in the middle, are the groups, I should say, in the middle, are the key people that drive this life cycle. And the acronyms for each phase are those people that are mostly responsible at each phase of the life cycle. So we have the CDS committee, which we already talked about. We have the knowledge engineers who are specialized in CDS design as well as knowledge management. Clinical informaticians who help guide the process and act as expertise. Subject matter experts. We need subject matter experts to make sure we're creating this thing that's going to work correctly in the system, and not that that always happens, but we always do use subject matter experts. Application coordinators who take what we've designed and build it in the system, and then the reporting team so that we can get out information out of the system and run analysis on it. And so the first phase is the request. Any great idea we take. We really do take any request. We do have a form that guides people on what to answer on the request. We really do want the request to come in well-formed. We don't want to have a request that just says we want a CDS that improves diabetic management, which, believe it or not, we did get one of those requests. We had to break that out and work with the requester to define that a little bit more. We're able to identify similar or related or duplicate, right, because we don't want to work on something that we already have. Perhaps it's just an enhancement to something we already have. Throughout the process, the submitter is kept informed of the status of their request, and the requests are tracked with a lot of metadata. When did it come in? Who sent the request in, et cetera, et cetera. And like I said, this is a screenshot of our Excel spreadsheet, which we use for the request. It contains instructions and email addresses, and we're transitioning really now away from Excel and to an online form. You can imagine why. But really, our ultimate goal is self-service, that we can have it there. People can go in, put their stuff in, and any time they need, they can go in and see, so I wonder what they're doing with my stuff now. And so we get the request. Requests are accepted, processed, and released on a continuous rolling basis. Even during all the go-lives we have, we just keep rolling through them. But they're worked based on site priority. So just because it's not like a first-come, first-served thing. Just because you got yours in on Monday doesn't mean yours is going to be worked before the person who sent it in on Friday. We have folks that prioritize them. And then the workload is balanced against support and maintenance requests. So if there's a break fix in the system, we do need to balance that. We can't have all of our work on new stuff, but we also don't put all of our work on the support and maintenance either. Members of the CDS committee and CDS planning committee are the folks that approve and prioritize these requests. And they look at them for, is it desirable? Is it feasible? Is there a cost benefit to the organization? And is it the best method of implementing this thing, right? Maybe it's not an alert. Maybe it's some inherent functionality in the system. And regulatory requirements often do drive the priority. So even though it may have just come in today, if it's a regulatory impact, it will likely get to the top of the bucket. And that makes sense. And we document everything transparently. So this formal voting, a vote tally, etc. And here is that example of our collaboration tool. You can see on the left-hand side, and this is a database. This is one asset within the bigger database. You can see the fields on the left are the questions on the request form. There's the copy of the original Excel spreadsheet, which we're moving away from. There's a link to our CDS tracking tool, and this is where everything really starts. Once you get here, you can follow the trajectory throughout the life cycle. And there's an area for decisions, who was involved, and then the final result. And so design, which is kind of the exciting part of this whole thing, right? It's kind of boring going through the request and the approval and so forth. But once we get the green light, then it's time to dig in and start designing. So the output of the design phase is really a design specification, and just like the name implies, it's basically documentation of what we want built. And I kind of always think of this as the blueprint. You want to build a house, so you kind of make a blueprint and give it to the builder in a way. Trust me, it's a little bit trickier, I think. Well, I've never built a house, so I don't know. So we use, in the CDS tracking tool, it's a semi-structured form. We document all of the collaboration we have with all of the parties. You know, the subject matter expert is really key in this step of the life cycle. We can report, we can export, we have robust metadata, and we have links to all of the other phases of the life cycle. We are we're improving this CDS over time. We really want more concrete structured fields. You know, it started as, you know, the little truck that could or whatever, and we keep making it better and better and better. We now have a lot of filters. We have dashboards. Again, we want it to be transparent to the end user so that they can go in and look at their stuff to see where it's at. And then the build. So the build output, so again, we hand over the blueprint. The application coordinator now takes it and puts it into the EHR, right? That's the whole, you know, kind of almost the end game is get it into the EHR. After they get it into the EHR, they also do some manual documentation of what they did. And it uses that same CDS tracking tool. Again, we document the communication. We're able to report. We have metadata and linkage. Right now, however, the build specification really mirrors the design, and that's not great. Our future goal is to have a lot more structured fields here so that we know the flow sheet row IDs, the groupings of medications that were put in, a lot of other criteria, because this helps us with our dependencies. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of dependencies with our CDS. And the future state is forget the manual documentation, that we should be able to extract out of the editors what was built and put it into our CDS tracking tool. So that's future. I don't know when future is yet. And then, of course, so great, it's built. We do not put it into production without testing. So the purpose of testing is to test the CDS to make sure if it's been built correctly. We have test cases that are written and executed in an external software. Then we take those results and we put them back into our CDS tracking tool. So again, anytime we want, we can go into the CDS tracking tool and determine, has it failed, has the test cases even been written? And this screenshot shows that, you know, there's one person who wrote the test cases, there's another person who signed off, there's another person who did the test execution. And all of those people are different people than who did the design. We want to make sure that, you know, that we have a really good, solid test here. And then comes the monitoring part, which is another favorite part of mine. And the purpose of monitoring is to confirm that the CDS is still firing and working as intended, because it's amazing how things can shift when you go from a test environment to the production environment. So we developed a portal. Again, this too started very minimal and has really grown over the last year and a half. And this is a screenshot of our portal. And we look at things like, what's the firing rate? Is it sky high? Oh boy, we better tweak that. Or is it not firing? We better look at why not. But other things like, is it firing for the right patient? What about for the right provider? Is it firing in the right workflow, which you'll see further on, down, perhaps not. And is it appropriately silenced? There's nothing worse than having a CDS that tells you to do something you already did. That would be really irritating. We try not to irritate the nurses out there because they're very busy. Again, we put that information back into our CDS tracking tool so that we always know what's going on. And this is 2 screenshots of our CDS tracking tool. The one to the right is a summary of all of our CDS, so we know at any given time of our 500 things that are in there, what is its monitoring status. And then the one to the left is one individual CDS, so tell me details about that one CDS. And we have the types of monitoring, which is pre-activation. We always monitor things in a silent mode before we activate them, before the nurse actually sees it. And that, depending on what we find there, we will or will not release it active. And then, of course, we don't just throw it in there and say, oh, great, well, we do post-activation monitoring, right, because we want to make sure it's still working. Ad hoc monitoring happens for whenever we think we should look at things. Mostly it's if we have a reported issue from a user, we'll immediately go into the portal and start looking at what's going on there. And then the last phase of the life cycle is evaluation, which, sometimes it's difficult to determine what is monitoring, what is evaluation, and sometimes they kind of merge together into the same thing. But it is a little different because the evaluation is it doing what it's intended to do? We put it in there to do something. We put it in there to, decrease the rate of hospital-acquired urinary infections. Well, did it do that? Did it have the change we were trying to get to? And how are recipients responding to it? And that's really important. And Denise is going to go through several slides about how recipients are or are not responding to the CDS. And so we use that same portal, like I said. Future state for our evaluation is really to get even more data. Right now, we can only get the data from the actual CDS when it, I'm going to say, pops up when it's being interacted with. But we want to get a wider breadth of information to see, if the CDS is making an impact. So I'm going to turn it over now to Denise, who's really going to show some evaluation analysis that we did on a subset of nursing CDS at BWH.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. So Karen did a great job. I'm going to have to put my glasses on here of talking about the CDS life cycle. And she talked about working within the test environment, and she talked about working in the production environment in terms of the build. Well, then I play in the clinical environment, right? So the rubber has to meet the road, so to speak, when you do all of that incredibly detailed, thoughtful planning and building, and then you put it into the clinical environment, right? And then no matter how we all as informaticians think our users are going to interact with it, we never really know, do we? We think we know, but we don't know. So the part that Karen talked about of the evaluation is, okay, so we did all this great planning, all this work, design, build, test, monitor. Now we put it out in the clinical environment. We say, okay, so how are our users going to interact with this? Before I get there, I do want to say that of course, there's a lot of evidence in the literature, right, that clinical decision support has been successfully integrated into electronic health records for nursing, right? But Karen did point out that at Partners, this is essentially new within the body of our documentation, that we've been working with this with our EMARs in many of our sites, but that within the body of our documentation, of our flow sheet, note documentation, we really haven't been interacting with clinical decision support, but we know from the literature that this was an important step for us to take. We also did some analysis of our clinical decision support requests in 2014. Is Kim in the room? Is she here? Kim Whalen, one of our NENIC members. She published this article in 2016, where we really did an analysis of what the requests were. And you can see the requests that were up there, the risk assessment, risk reduction, promotion of healthy habits. All of what was found in that analysis really mirrored what was in the literature already. So that was good to know that we were sort of working off of what others had already seen. All right, so we went to design, right? So we were very strategic in how we designed these clinical decision support tools, or if you're familiar with the vendor that we're using, they refer to these as best practice advisory. So we were strategic. We said that our interventions were going to be rule-based, and they would be driven off of the nursing assessment documentation. We decided that they would be non-interrupted alerts, so we decided against pop-ups. So when I say non-interrupted, we didn't put a pop-up that a nurse needed to interact with to proceed. We were going to present these decision supports within the admission assessment and within the shift assessment documentation screens. So it would be available to the nurses in places where they were working and doing their documentation, but not popping up in their face. Seemed like good, sound rationale. So the nurse, when presented with this CDS, she could agree with and act on the recommendation. She could acknowledge it, but not act on the recommendation, and she could choose not to interact with it at all, right, because it's non-interactive. So here is a button where she could choose to acknowledge that she had seen the decision support, or links to interact with the decision support tool and accept, if you would, the recommendation of this BPA, of this clinical decision support. I'm really trying hard not to say BPA. All right. So that was our strategic design. And I think we did a pretty good job with our strategic design, but we had some not so strategic education. And what I mean by that is that within the training program remember, we were implementing these at the same time we were going live on this vendor EHR. So this inclusion of reviewing and showing and teaching, and I put that in quotations, about these CDS tools was part of that implementation education. So you can imagine what happened. That sort of got buried, right, in all of the other big stuff. We also had, I had some expectation that because our clinical staff were used to clinical decision support within our EMAR that they had been using for over 10 years, that this really wouldn't be a big deal, that they'd just move on, they'd see it, they'd know what it was, they'd move on, and that's the way it would be. But as I've said, the scope, the size and scope of our EHR implementation, really for most of us who were involved in that, we prioritized safe medication use and documenting vital signs. We were really low on Maslow's hierarchy. We just needed to make sure that we were keeping our patients safe, and this really wasn't on our radar at the time. But, this evaluation that I'm going to share with you really showed us, we learned that we really, if we wanted them to interact with these windows, we needed to do a better job of educating them up front of what they were and what the expectation was for staff to use them. All right, so the other question is, so how do you fit clinical decision support within the nurse's workflow, right? Because we know that whatever we do, whatever it is we do, we have to fit it in within the workflow, because if we don't fit it in with the workflow, folks really aren't going to pay much attention to it. They're going to find their way around it and move on to other things with, that they need to do. So first decision was to embed these within the nursing assessment. So we know our nurses are doing assessment, they're doing reassessment all day long, right? This is a primary part of their role. So we want to facilitate data capture of this assessment, right? So we're using the EHR as the tool. And now that we are using the EHR as the tool, we're capturing, right, that assessment data in a coded, structured way so we can do something with it. We couldn't do much with it when it was on paper pre-2015. We couldn't do much with it. Now we have coded, structured data in our EHR so we can apply CDS rules to it. And then the decision of to trigger or not to trigger the CDS becomes possible because we have now structured information. And then based on whether to trigger or not to trigger, we hopefully are meeting the information needs of our nurses. We're providing them with information within their workflow, within their documentation screens that then allows the nurse to determine whether she's going to take an action or a non-action. And then the way it was built then that this CDS would persist within the screen if there was no interaction with it, or could be silenced or disappear, if you would, from the screen if there was interaction with the CDS. So presenting this CDS to the nurse then within her workflow hopefully helps to guide knowledge-based decision-making, right? And this is really why we do this, why we're doing all this work. And then from that, act on the evidence-based recommended actions that we presented to them. In this case, and what we're going to be talking about is really interventions related to the plan of care. Make sense? Okay, great. So we decided to go ahead on that life cycle. The last box that Karen shared with us was we needed to do an evaluation. So we decided to evaluate the action taken by nurses when they were presented with these CDS intervention alerts related to risk of falls, risk of skin breakdown, and patient restraint use, right? Apple pie and ice cream for us, right? These. So we chose these domains because these CDS rules fire solely within the nursing documentation. They're not being fired for anybody else, so it was a good test of our behavior. The accountability for the assessment, intervention, outcomes associated with these elements, they're all within our scope of nursing practice. So they're important to us, to our patients. Fall risk and skin integrity are contained in the NQI, and we all know that appropriate restraint use is a Joint Commission standard, and they're paying close attention to this. So these seem like three important CDS for us to take a look at. So Karen really did the yeoman's work with the data analysis piece. Basically, what she did was she extracted for these three intervention alerts the firing data from our electronic health record. She separated them into discrete worksheets. She sorted them by date, time, patient ID, and follow-up action. She removed rows that were not unique, that is, the AKA are duplicates that ended up in there, and then coded the actions by accepted, overridden, or ignored. So as I might have said already, so when we considered something accepted was when the nurse clicked on the link within that alert that brought her out to the plan of care. If she clicked the button acknowledge, that was an overridden because she acknowledged and didn't do the recommended action, and then ignored when absolutely no interaction took place. The data set represents 22 weeks of time beginning at about 5 months after we went live. So can anybody guess what my results are going to be? Paula, you can't say. Any non-partners person can guess? Sure. 5%. I think 5%. Okay. All right, let's take a look. So first of all, the alert fired over 30,000 times in that 22 weeks of data collection. So the 5%. So here's what's interesting about statistics. You can make them do numbers. You can make them tell any story. So let's just look at the Morse for a second. So the fall risk CDS fired 17,000 times in that 22-week period. 1,500 times. I don't know what that percentage is, but 1,500 times of the 17,000 times a nurse interacted with it. And 799 times out of that 1,500, or 50% of the time that it was interacted with, did the nurse take the recommended action. So really, these numbers are much lower. They're 0.1% to much lower than we would like to see, where there was an interaction at all. So I tried to focus on the time that, take a look at that. I think the important information here for me is that only 15 to 52% of the time in which a nurse chose to interact with this alert did she take the recommended action. So there's a lot here to think about, right? Because you did hear us, right? There's a tremendous amount of thought that goes into the request, into the design, into the build, into the test. But, rubber meets the road. We put it out into the clinical environment, and you just don't know what you're going to get, which is why we do these evaluations, right? So then we held a focus group with nurses and said, okay, so let's see if we can figure out why it looks the way it does, with about 32 clinical nurses from across Brigham and Women's Hospital from different areas. And these are the questions that we asked within this focus group. Really, does an alert that recommends plan of care interventions have value within your documentation workflow? Right? Does this have value to you? Because we were worried that the reason that people weren't interacting with it was because they really didn't see that it had value. We chose it strategically to be non-interruptive to your workflow. Was this the right decision? Would it have been better for us to put a pop-up that you had to interact with before you moved forward? And then what other reasons might you have had for not interacting with the alert or with the alert recommendation, even for those who went in and interacted with it? So these are the themes that emerge: design, education, alert fatigue. Nothing that we don't know about, nothing that's not already in the literature. Here it was. Somehow we missed something with the design, and we missed something with the education, and guess what? Alert fatigue still exists, no matter what we do. So let's look at some of what the nurses told us. So I love this one on the top. I've never seen it. So how is it possible? How is it possible that if we put it in the admission assessment tool and the shift assessment tool, that this nurse, who happened to be one of our super users, had never seen it? Well, it turns out that there's another pathway to do the documentation that we expect of them in the shift assessment tool. We built a very nice list of required documents. And so this nurse's workflow was to go find that list with the link to all of the required documents and go into all of the required document elements, and that's how she documented. So she never found her way to the assessment tool, aka Navigator in this vendor, never found herself, didn't use the shift assessment, just went to the patient story where there's a little tab that says required documentation, did all her documentation that way. So remember I said no matter how we plan and how we think we're building for our users, we have no idea what they're going to find in order to do their documentation. Another nurse said, I didn't see the link to the plan of care, and maybe I hit acknowledge and didn't even realize that the link to take me out to the plan of care to act on the recommended action was really even there. I guess I missed that. All right. I wasn't ready to go to the plan of care. Wait a minute. I thought we did all of our planning to fit within the nurse's workflow. I guess we thought about that, right? We know that from the evidence that you have to build things for within the nurse's workflow in order for it to work. And we knew that, right? We're experienced. We've done this before. But guess what? They weren't ready to go to the plan of care. And then there were some suggestions. Can the problem automatically populate? Can it do this? Can it display here? And so, there was a lot of potential solutions that came up. But here we thought we had done a fabulous job with our design, but they told us they had other thoughts about that. So we put this back up here again because remember, this was our strategic, design here, right? We said that we were going to do non-interruptive alerts in an interactive window within the admission assessment and the shift assessment. But look what we also did. We made these buttons big, and we made the recommended action, the action that we wanted them to take, is kind of hidden over here. But the action we didn't really want them to take is kind of big buttons here, right in their face. Hello. So I had to show that again because okay. So then we know about the education and the alert fatigue. The nurse said, well, I didn't really understand what it was. Now, they understood the content of it. They understood that the patient was at high risk for falls or was at risk for their skin integrity or, they had a restraint flow sheet, but they didn't have an order. They understood what it was saying to them, but they didn't understand what was expected of them to do with it. Because remember, their education for it was a long time ago at a time when they were just trying to figure out how they were going to document their vital signs and their meds. So this wasn't something that they were ready to learn at that time, so they really didn't know it. And then our fatigue, every patient gets it, so I just ignore it, right? Because probably most of our patients are at risk for fall and have skin integrity risks, right? So they see that yellow box up there. They see it for all of their patients. Okay, yeah, I get it. They're at risk for fall. But what we intended, the intention of the alert was to take them to the plan of care, to have them put the problem into the patient's plan of care, to identify goals, to identify interventions that were specific to that patient. This is what our intent for this was to move them over to the plan of care and plan and document interventions that would help prevent that fall or prevent that skin breakdown. And then it's just one more thing to look at. So what we know is that at this time, people are still learning to use the tool. It takes a long time to use these very complex, data-heavy screens, busy screens that people are taking their time to learn how to use. So it takes a little bit of, so that's not surprising. So our lessons learned. certainly the education effort was lost in the larger implementation activities. Talked about that a little bit. You know, we hear this all the time as builders when we build and we're trying to design systems for our users, for our nurses to use, to make it easy to do the right thing. So we still believe that the rationale for using the non-interruptive alert was sound. Certainly, every patient would have this pop up, and that noise we just didn't want to do. We would just annoy them terribly, and it probably wouldn't last long anyway. We'd get such bad phone calls from them. But we recognized that a couple of things. The alert itself was not necessarily in a user workflow friendly location. Why was that? Well, the first thing is that we built it in the admission assessment. So what happens with the admission assessment? For those who do use it and didn't find their workaround, they go into it once. They do their admission assessment. The alert fires, and then they move on. They go to their flow sheets, and that's where they work. They never go back. So if somebody didn't interact with it, it just sits there. It's part of my ignored column, right? It just sat there because they went on to do their other work. They were busy. They had to do that assessment, and then they had to go complete their flow sheet, take care of their patient. They had things to do, so it wasn't necessarily. And then it was in the shift assessment, and it's in a nice place in our shift assessment screen, right up at the top. Should see it, but guess what? The shift assessment is not being used by the majority of folks. Like, we're just now starting to get around to understand that people didn't even know that was there. Because why? Why do we think? Well, the shift assessment was a tool to help walk them through what they needed to document at the end of their shift. But where do nurses spend the majority of their time? In their flow sheet. They don't need this thing over here to tell them what they need to document. They have a flow sheet. They know what they need to document, and I stay over here. So we didn't really make it easy for them to do the right thing. And then contextualizing the alerts, putting them in a place that would emphasize their importance. We think perhaps within the workflow of the flow sheet, it would do that. And then, the final lesson really to include, we had clinical folks and a number of clinical folks and subject matter experts and nurses who were involved in the life cycle that Karen described. But again, until you put it in the clinical environment and start using it, you just don't know how folks are going to behave. So what's next for us? So we're going to apply enhancements that align with best practices, right? There's a lot of best practices that are out there in the literature. So we're going to look at the enhancements that we need to make. We're going to align them with best practices and our lessons learned. So the good news is that the user interface has changed with our recent upgrade, so that the visual has changed, right? So it's easier, so that it guides the user to do what the recommended action is. So we've made those buttons a little smaller, and yeah, I see Paula nodding, so I'm not saying anything that isn't true. And the one thing we're doing is we're reconsidering the location of the non-interruptive alert. So we've already met with the partners, Nursing Informatics Advisory Committee. We've presented this. We've talked about the possibility of putting these alerts in other places, specifically perhaps within the flow sheet, perhaps within the plan of care, a place where nurses are daily in and out of. We're instituting a re-education and communication program. We've already started that. As Karen said, we're going to continue to monitor. We're also going to start to hold the requesters a little bit more accountable for what they're requesting and the follow-up following the request or following the build. So that whole request process, you're not going to be able to I'm not going to be able to walk up to Karen and put my request in and say, I want a CDS for this, and then abdicate any responsibility for it. So we hope that will help us a little bit. So just in conclusion, I listed here for your reference, some of the best practices that we know that are in the literature, I think are, they align and confirm with the lessons that we have, and that our findings demonstrate that the application of known best practices that you find in this literature for CDS requires explicit translation. So we needed to rethink, or maybe I needed to reread the literature to apply them within the nursing documentation workflows. And then to really do also, and we know this, we have to work within the technical limitations that we have with our vendors. So it isn't that we can, do it however we want, wherever we want, whenever we want. There are some limitations that we have in terms of making this right. And then we put this list up here just to reiterate how many people it takes to do this. I mean, this is a village of very bright, experienced, talented people who are working on doing this, and this is the list that we could come up with. And there may be more that we left out. And with that, I thank you from both of us, and we'll open it up to questions.
In case there's some people who are asking questions. Okay. Sharon, please ask the question. Hi.
Well, actually, we can introduce you to one right here. It's Amy Silver.
Oh, wait a minute.
Hold on 1 second.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, they can't hear.
The question was, who are the knowledge engineers under Lifecycle?
Sure. So the knowledge engineers are part of the clinical informatics team at Partners eCare. We have a knowledge engineer right here, Amy Silver, who is actually working on the enhancement for this particular Braden scale BPA. So.
Thank you both very much. There's a lot of knowledge there. Thank you so much. I have a question about the life cycle and how long does it actually take on average to build and go through all of that for one CDS? I know it depends on multiple factors, but on average.
It really does depend, and we have tried to get maybe an average, and we really did come up with some statistics, I guess, on how long it takes, and it's typically, and again, this is just the average, maybe 38 hours to go from I guess prioritization through to monitoring, and 38 hours in total doesn't mean 30. It doesn't mean 1 week.
Over many weeks.
It's over many weeks. Yeah, I guess it depends what you mean, hour or time, because it takes a lot of time, and it can get stuck in certain phases, rightly so. We don't want to move things through prematurely, right? We want everyone to agree as we move forward. So some things have taken, what would you say, Amy, 2 months, where others 2 years. If it has labs in it, it's another whole story.
Thank you. This is actually more of a practical question. So I understand the whole life cycle, and I understand what it takes to actually get the CDS out. But one of the things that strikes me is about when you look at how often people aren't using it, is that perhaps maybe one of the things that I think of that we could do a little differently is to actually do usability testing with actual end users that could help enhance the appearance or where people think that it might get the most use.
Yes. And just for those on the phone to repeat, I'm not sure if you were able to hear that, but there was a suggestion about potentially usability data to increase the usage of CDS once it's implemented. That's a great idea.
I like your tracking tool. Is that something you built yourself or you purchased that?
It's an open source tool that we designed from the foundation up, I guess, yeah. So we ended up using an open source tool and then designing it.
Okay. Mary, you have to use the mic. You're not above.
I really have to applaud your strategy because I think it's so exciting to hear that you focused on the things that nurses are so involved with, responsible for, falls, skin care, and restraint uses. My question is twofold. The first one is pretty straightforward, is that, and I also applaud the very thoughtful way, and it seems like the world goes by so fast. It's nice to see how you get to really build a community within the nursing department, which it sounds almost like a luxury. It's really wonderful. But my question is, in addition to usability, are you also giving the staff metrics so they can see, is there an impact or an outcome related to, if I identify this patient's at risk for falls, I'm able to see this in reports and quality, so they know, you could basically, in my head, I can see, okay, here are all the X number of patient care units, and here is the people that use the alert, and here are the people that don't. Mm-hmm. And could you speak to that?
I think this evaluation Mary, was really our first foray into this. What you didn't ask me, that I thought someone would ask me, is, well, is it possible, how many patients of those that were ignored actually had the problem in their plan of care? They just didn't interact with this. So step number 2 is really going to be looking at the interaction with the alert and actual entry of the problem into the plan of care, right? So I really need to do that association. Then step 3 is, okay, so we have a tool, we have an alert, we have a plan of care, will this impact our falls, our skin? That's a very complicated question. We are a long way, I think, all of us in our systems, away from being able to link the plan, the intervention with the outcome, the way our current EHRs are built. But you hit the nail on the head, right? That's the gold standard. That's the pot of gold at the end of the yellow brick road. We want to be able. We're building these things because we really want to be able to pull out that data. Our plan, our intervention, and our outcome. But we're actually, a few steps away from being able to do that. And Karen and I talked about this when we were doing this evaluation. It's like, okay, the next evaluation we have to do when we look at all of this is now we need to go in and see, well, they didn't use the alert to go to the plan of care. So we said, well, they were non-compliant or they didn't accept the recommendation. But did they? And they just didn't use this tool to go there. It's part of that workflow question that we didn't have the answer to.
And we are working towards that in our monitoring portal to be able to get, like I said, that broader scope of information, not just from the Sidious, but what happened, 10 minutes after the Sidious fired, was the plan of care added. Rita?
Great presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Your structured data collection, storage and analysis is fabulous. But I want to make a point about the evaluation, which is, of course, when you implement an intervention, you've got proximal outcomes, you've got distal outcomes. So a proximal outcome could be, you apply the alert, did the problem end up on the plan of care?
Right.
That's the proximal outcome. The distal outcome is, okay, the problem on the plan of care, are you making it better? That's very difficult. There's so many intervening things that you can't control.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah. No, we appreciate that, Rita, and I think that as we were looking at, I couldn't hear Rita. Right. I have to repeat that. I I think what Rita was commenting on was that she said that really the one of the outcomes of the alert, the proximal outcome, in her term, would be that the problem would land on the plan of care. But that a very distal outcome of that would be that the interventions actually prevented the fall or prevented the skin breakdown, but that there are so many variables between entering that problem on the plan of care and actually being able to measure the outcome, that's a very difficult thing to do. And it's something obviously we'd all like to be able to do, but it's not easy. It's not right there for us yet to be able to do that. What Karen and I want to be able to do now is really take a look at, once we make some of these enhancements that we learned from this evaluation, is really be able to associate, whether or not the patient actually did have a plan of care. So our next set of data would be, well, there was no interaction with it, but in fact, there was a problem on the plan of care, and then we have to rethink, well, do these have any value? Because they're not using these to take them to the plan of care, and if they're not using these to take them to the plan of care, then it's not in the right place in the workflow, or it's not the right time for them, like that we heard, but that they're informational, and if we supply them with the information and we see evidence that the information, well, we see evidence that if the problem is there, we could make some assumption that the information we gave them influenced them and the action of putting the problem there. But it could be there could be a number of reasons why the nurse who are super user, great nurse who never saw it, I'm sure those problems, I would bet those problems were on her plan of care. So the association between the two is going to be difficult to really determine. I think there's another question up there, Mary. And trying to speak right close to the microphone so the folks on the phone can hear you.
It's intimidating. I just had a question because I'm still a practicing nurse, and I also do the feedback that I have as a practicing nurse, and I hear as well as from the clinical areas I support, is documentation is the less documentation they have to do, the better. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if these alerts and these BPAs are causing them to have to do more documentation. The other thing I had heard when I took the inpatient class is that the plan of care process within that EMR is challenging. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if it's not that I think they're just in that phase of learning. Mm-hmm. And they're not potentially able to do it because they don't really understand it, but also because from their perspective, I mean, they're always asking me, how can I, not document things? Don't add one more thing for me to document.
Yeah. So to summarize, what we heard was these big EHRs are hard to use, right? They're way built. They're built. There's a lot of potential places to document, and they're not always easy and intuitive to use. That's right. The other side of it is that our responsibility, our role as nurses, is to develop a plan of care for our patient, right? So we know that our patients are at risk for what we talked about today. We know that our responsibility for our patients is to develop a plan of care, to select goals for our patients, to select interventions for our patients to help prevent falls and skin breakdown and all of this. So I appreciate how hard it is to get used to using these electronic tools, and our job as informatics nurses is to really help design it as best we can. Remember, I said within the technical constraints we have with our vendors to design it as best we can, and then to help support and educate as best we can as to how to use the tools. I don't disagree with you at all. I would love nurses to actually document less. But what we need to do is be very thoughtful about what the less is. You know, it can't just be I want to document less. I want to document less things that have no value to the patient's stay or my care of this patient. I mean, we have to figure this out, because what I'd love to do is start taking, flow sheet rows away that really pose no value, but nurses feel like they need to fill in because they're there. So we have some thinking to do on that, but I don't disagree with you. Oh, no. Sometimes it's... Thank you.
We have a question on the screen.
Sure. So it's I believe it's Jewel who asked, how many Sidious alerts did you create for nursing, and what criteria did you use to select them? So interestingly, right now we have 500 alerts across all disciplines. Only 30 of those are for nursing. Specifically for nurses, right? There's nurses in some of the other ones, but we have a lot of CDS, and so they go through the exact same criteria. It doesn't mean that, nurses only have 30, they get 2 more. Everything goes into the same bucket. It's approved, one at a time, and then it's prioritized against all of the work we have to do. So there are times where there's a nursing CDS enhancement that is up against maybe a provider CDS that is a regulatory, CDS, and it's not always an answer people want to hear. But that is why we have a very structured life cycle and a very structured approval and prioritization.
And I think that Karen talked about, you saw up there on one of her slides about the questions that are asked when that request comes in. It's not just this is a good idea, or this person requested it, so let's move forward with it. It's on the request list. We really sit down and think. I mean, these things, because of their impact within the nurse's workflow, really have to be thought through, as with a lot of those questions that she presented. In terms of its impact, in terms of its value to patients, its value to nurses, and we've tried to choose those which really have the greatest impact, the highest value.
And the user had said is one of the criteria core measures, and yes, that regulatory bucket is definitely and typically gets placed on the top of the list, depending. But yes.
Hi. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation. We don't utilize your EMR. We're on your competitor's EMR. So my question, though, has to be, when you use the BPAs and they launch the user out to the to the plan of care, does it, if they have 4 of them and they don't acknowledge the first 3 and they go out on number 4 to the POC, can they update all of their items at that same time and still get credit for it? Because I can see where, because we tend to use more of a pop-up functionality and a to-do functionality along those lines. So we're asking the users to launch out and do it all in one step, but I could see where they might miss this in here. So my question is, does it support them going out and completing all of their steps at once? Or is it designed to just say, if I'm in the fall risk assessment, I want you to add the fall risk problem in there, but you might get down to another system assessment, and now I want you to add a second problem in there, and where you possibly could have done them at the same time.
That's a tough question. I'll try to summarize that. Is how is the user able to interact with these CDS, especially if there's a bunch of them, whether or not they're pop-ups or waiting for you to interact with them? And it's kind of a complicated question because the CDS acted one way just a couple weeks ago, and now they act a very different way after our upgrade. So I'm going to struggle to answer this, but we did not like the way it was before, which they were all, let's say, 4 or 5 presented in one window. And if you said okay or accept, you accepted all of them. And so you kind of got, I'm going to say, credit for answering the whole bucket of things, which didn't make sense. They are now individual, which we wanted. And yes, you can link out and then come back. Now, some people have, just like Denise had said, you kind of learn this workaround. They can keep the window there, and they can go over and add the plan of care, right, without interacting with the BPA. And that's one of the things we really want to do in future analysis is find out, is that what they're doing? And it could very well be. And that's, that's unanswered to this point. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Are you got your children? Where are you from? Oh, okay. Any more questions on the phone?
I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. I was wondering, did Karen and Denise, did you have any discussion about, or was there discussion about the best practice advisory and the responses to that? Is that part of the patient's legal medical record, or is that just an overlay, or what would be the implications if a nurse chose that they didn't acknowledge it or they chose not to take the recommendations? Is that part of the patient's record that could be pulled out by, anybody legal or somebody auditing that record?
That's a very good question. Not one that Karen and I have had discussion about, but the answer would be yes. Just like we could pull the data out and know what alert had been interacted with, that information is available.
I'm just wondering if that puts us at risk. That's all. I started to think about it when it's, the terminology is, that I bypassed it or I acknowledged it and didn't do anything about it, that one in particular, that if somebody was reviewing that, what would the interpretation of that be, especially if the patient had an event that a harmful event?
That is a really good point.
Good point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for this really exciting and informative discussion tonight. I'd like to thank Denise. I want to give a round of applause. And Karen. And thank you to everybody on the phone. We're going to conclude our program at this time. Thank you very much. Have a nice night.